He wears a laurel, not a crown, yet Rome's laurel tightens like a noose. The empire calls it divinity, but every emperor knows it's a sentence. Behind marble columns and golden light, daggers breathe in the dark. The men who cheer today will cut his throat tomorrow. To rule Rome is to hold the world, and feel its weight crush your soul. Tonight, we ask a question Rome itself never dared to answer. Was being emperor not the highest honour, but the most terrifying curse ever placed upon a Roman soul? Rome's first emperor never called himself emperor. Augustus understood the most dangerous word in Latin was rex, king, and so he crafted a mask, not a throne. He wrapped monarchy in the language of the Republic, pretending to serve while quietly reshaping the world. Senators still met, voted, and debated, but the script had already been written. Every decision ended with the same name, Augustus Caesar. He called himself princeps, the first citizen. But behind that modest title was the greatest deception in political history. The Senate believed they still ruled. The people believed they were still free. Only Augustus knew he had built a machine that could never stop. He kept the Republic's clothes but replaced its bones. He learned from Julius Caesar's corpse, power too visible is a provocation. So he built what historians later called the Principate, a government pretending not to be one. The Senate gave him provinces, but conveniently those provinces contained the legions. He held imperium maius, supreme command, yet smiled like a servant. But every ruler, no matter how careful, fears the sword that guards his sleep. Augustus needed protectors. He created an elite force, the Praetorian Guard. They were not common soldiers. They were the emperor's shadow, 9 cohorts of Rome's finest, stationed close to the heart of power. They guarded the palace, the Senate, and the man who ruled them all. At first, they were loyal, or at least loyal enough. They escorted the emperor, stood behind his chair, and filled the marble corridors with the whisper of steel. But Augustus had planted a seed of doom. The guard would one day realize what even emperors feared to admit, that the one who guards the throne could also claim it. By the time Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind a Rome drenched in illusion. His reforms promised eternity, but they carried within them the germs of decay. The empire would grow, but so would its paranoia. The emperor's chair was not a seat of rest. It was a spotlight that never dimmed, burning through anyone who dared sit on it. The marble face of Augustus smiled on every coin. His name became divine. His family, the Julio Claudians, inherited both his glory and his curse, because the illusion worked too well. The people no longer remembered freedom, only the emperor who gave them bread, games, and silence. In creating stability, Augustus created dependence, and in giving Rome a master, he ensured that one day the master would be devoured by his own protectors. The Principate looked eternal, but beneath the gold leaf, cracks had begun to form. The lie was working, and that was the danger. Rome believed it had found balance, a republic ruled by a king who refused to admit he was one. But a crown denied is not a crown destroyed. It only waits for the next hand bold enough to grasp it. After Augustus came Tiberius, a soldier, a scholar, and a man who hated people. He did not enjoy power, he endured it. The empire had become too large for one mind, too poisonous for one heart. Tiberius ruled by delegation, and that was his first mistake. He trusted a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus began as a servant of order, but he understood something even Augustus never faced. Access is power. Whoever controlled the emperor's presence controlled the empire itself. Tiberius, weary of Rome's conspiracies, retreated to the island of Capri. There, surrounded by sea cliffs and silence, he sent letters instead of commands, and each letter passed through Sejanus. The guards' barracks were moved closer to the city centre. The Praetorians now stood not on the outskirts, but within the veins of Rome. A man once tasked with protection had become the empire's filter. Sejanus decided who spoke to the emperor, who received orders, who lived or died. Senators bowed to him, wives whispered his name, statues were raised in his honour. Rome had seen tyrants before, but Sejanus was something new. Tyranny without title. The man behind the curtain had learned to pull the strings in daylight. When power hides behind loyalty, it becomes invisible, and therefore untouchable. For years, Tiberius allowed it. The Senate, paralyzed by fear, accepted it, until whispers reached Capri that Sejanus was preparing something more than obedience. Perhaps a coup, perhaps a crown. In 31 CE, Tiberius wrote a letter to the Senate, calm, measured, and signed by his own hand. When read aloud, it praised Sejanus. For a moment, Rome held its breath. Then came the final line, "Execute him." Panic exploded in the chamber. Sejanus's supporters fled, his enemies cheered. The Praetorians hesitated, then obeyed the emperor's seal. The once untouchable commander was dragged from the Curia and strangled to death. For a few days, Rome rejoiced. The Senate pretended it had triumphed over corruption. But the lesson was darker. The Praetorian Guard had not been punished. They had carried out the order, yes, but they had also learned their true value. They understood the pattern. Emperors come and go, but the Guard remains. The throne can be made or unmade by the men who stand beside it. From that day, no emperor would ever sleep soundly again. The empire had no external enemies more dangerous than its own protectors. Sejanus's ghost lingered in every whisper of armour, in every rustle outside the emperor's chamber. Rome had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The day its guardians realised they were the gatekeepers of destiny. The Principate's illusion cracked, and through the fracture, ambition leaked. From now on, emperors would not just fear assassins. They would fear their guards, their scribes, their cooks. The cage of gold Augustus built was beginning to show its bars, and soon one emperor would test the bars until they broke, and pay the price in blood. Rome once cheered his name as a godsend. Gaius Caesar, called Caligula Little Boots, the soldier's child who had grown up in tents beside the legions, was the grandson of Augustus, the hope of a weary empire. When Tiberius died, people poured into the streets shouting his name as though daylight itself had returned. They had no idea that the dawn would end in blood. For the first few months, Caligula was everything Rome dreamed of. Generous, eloquent, radiant. He freed prisoners, honoured his mother's memory, and restored the games. But then illness struck. He recovered, but something inside him never healed. The man who rose from that bed believed he was more than human. He began calling himself Neos Helios, the new sun. He ordered temples to himself, demanded sacrifices, and replaced the faces of gods with his own. The Senate, trained by fear, applauded every blasphemy. But the Praetorian Guard, his daily shadows, saw what others could not. They watched the madness take shape. Caligula's humour was cruel. He toyed with the men who held his life in their hands. He would summon his commanders at night and ask impossible riddles, rewarding the wrong answers with exile or death. He named his horse Incitatus, a consul. He called himself Jupiter reborn, walking among mortals. And yet the danger was not his madness. Rome had survived crueler emperors. The danger was his mockery. Among the guards, one name stood out. Cassius Chaerea, an old soldier, serious, disciplined, humiliated too many times. When he asked for the day's password, Caligula answered with obscenities, filthy insults whispered for the amusement of the courtiers. The guard, once feared, had become a laughingstock. Humiliation breeds conspiracy. Chaerea began to whisper to others, men who had watched their emperor dance naked as a god, who had seen senators forced to run beside his chariot like slaves. Caligula's power was absolute, his death inevitable. On the 24th of January, 41 CE, as the emperor walked through a corridor beneath his palace after a festival, the air turned heavy. The marble echoed with footsteps. A man approached from behind, then another. Blades flashed. Chaerea struck first. 30 wounds. The god who mocked Jupiter's thunder died in silence, choking on mortal blood. His wife and child were slaughtered soon after. For a few hours, Rome had no emperor. The Senate gathered, whispering the impossible, "Let us restore the Republic." For a heartbeat, it almost happened. But then, armour. The sound of boots in marble corridors. The Praetorian Guard had arrived, and in their hands not a corpse but a living bargaining chip. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, trembling behind a curtain. The soldiers raised him up, their swords glittering, their meaning clear. The Republic would not return. The throne belonged to whoever could pay the price. That night, As Caligula's body cooled, Rome learned the truth Augustus had hidden. The emperor was not chosen by gods or senators. He was chosen by the men with swords. The curse had found its rhythm. When the Praetorian Guard dragged Claudius from behind the curtain, he was shaking. Historians say his knees gave out. He was no warrior, no demagogue. He was the stammering scholar of the Julio-Claudian house, the man no one ever thought would rule. But in that trembling man, the guard saw something better than strength: control. Claudius understood instantly what Caligula had not. Power could not be inherited. It had to be purchased. So when the guard offered him the throne, he did not argue, did not invoke divine right or family honour. He reached for Rome's oldest language, silver. Each Praetorian received 5 years' pay. It was not a gift, it was a contract. Loyalty, now and forever, would have a price. The empire had its first donative, a tradition that would bleed its rulers dry for centuries. The Senate protested, but the soldiers' swords glittered at the door. The people, weary of blood and chaos, accepted the new emperor. The illusion of legitimacy was complete. The Republic was dead, not by law, but by purchase. Claudius, once mocked as a fool, became a cautious, cunning administrator. He expanded the empire, conquered Britain, and filled Rome with building projects, but his throne never belonged to him. It belonged to the guard who had placed him there. He knew it. He never forgot it. Inside the palace, fear became routine. Every sound in the corridor, every whisper between servants could signal betrayal. His own wife, Messalina, plotted against him. Her lovers died, she followed soon after. Claudius remarried, this time to Agrippina the Younger, ambitious, brilliant, and deadly. She had a son, Nero. Claudius adopted him. Rome applauded. But behind the scenes, the guard watched, as always. They had become the true Senate, the invisible voters in every succession. Years later, Claudius died. Some say poisoned by mushrooms served by Agrippina. Nero took the throne, young, charismatic, promising art instead of war. But the debt remained. The guard demanded their donative and Nero paid it. Every emperor would, from that day forward. In that moment, the imperial system solidified, not as a monarchy, not as a republic, but as an economy of blood and coin. To survive, emperors would bribe their executioners in advance. Claudius's reign proved something terrible. The Praetorian Guard was no longer a wall protecting the emperor, it was a mirror reflecting his fear. And once a throne has a price, every man in Rome begins to calculate. The empire had become a marketplace of power. Every loyalty could be bought, every betrayal rented, and the bill was always paid, in silver first and blood later. The illusion Augustus built was cracking wider. The Republic had been an idea. The empire was a transaction. Rome was learning what it meant to be ruled not by law or gods, but by men who had learned that protection and profit were the same thing. In 68 CE, Nero's golden face cracked. The Senate declared him an enemy. His guards deserted, and the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors slit his own throat with trembling hands. The line of Augustus had ended, but the curse had only begun to show its teeth. The throne was empty, and for the first time in a century, Rome discovered that the world's most powerful empire had no rules for succession. Every legion, every general, every governor looked to Rome and thought the same thing. Why not me? Servius Sulpicius Galba, an old soldier from Spain, marched on the capital. The Senate hailed him emperor, but Galba made a fatal mistake. He believed in principle over survival. He refused to pay the donative the Praetorians demanded. Soldiers should obey, he said, not bargain. In those words lay his death warrant. Within days, the Praetorians turned on him. On the steps of the Forum in front of the people he thought he served, Galba's head was hacked from his body. His severed head was paraded through the streets on a spear while the crowd cheered for his replacement. Otho, a man who had bought the loyalty Galba thought could not be sold. Otho's rise was as swift as his fall. He promised stability, but another claimant was already marching from the north, Vitellius, commanding the Rhine legions. Otho's soldiers fought bravely but were crushed at Bedriacum. In despair, Otho did something rare among emperors. He killed only himself. His last words were almost noble, "Let others live." But Rome was done with mercy. Vitellius entered the city like a gluttonous god. He feasted as if empire were a banquet and duty a joke. He disbanded legions, humiliated senators, and let the treasury bleed. While he dined, the East rebelled. In Judea, a general named Vespasian, a farmer's son turned commander, was proclaimed emperor by his legions. The news spread like wildfire. Every province chose sides. The year became a carousel of emperors, each rising and dying faster than the Senate could mint their coins. Rome's marble streets turned red with blood. By December, Vespasian's forces, led by his ally Antonius Primus, stormed the city. They fought through alleys, temples, and burning markets. For 3 days, the capital of the world became a battlefield. Vitellius was dragged from hiding, his face swollen with wine and fear. He was beaten, stripped, and thrown into the Tiber. 3 emperors dead in 1 year, 1,000 senators executed, a city devoured by its own defenders. And yet, out of the carnage, Vespasian's march brought something new: understanding. Rome had finally learned its lesson. An emperor could not rule by lineage. He could not rule by Senate decree. He could only rule by mastering the math of survival, by paying the soldiers enough to delay the next betrayal. When Vespasian reached the throne, he rebuilt not only walls, but rules. He knew the empire's curse could never be lifted, but it could be managed. The blood of 69 CE was not just a tragedy, it was a revelation. Rome's stability depended not on gods or glory, but on the price of obedience. The emperors of the future would remember it well. Vespasian was not born into power. He earned it in mud and blood. A son of a tax collector, he rose through the legions, learning the rhythms of soldiers' hunger and fear. When he became emperor, he knew what Rome's aristocrats never did: that loyalty was a wage, not a virtue. He rebuilt the city with calm hands. Temples rose again, aqueducts flowed, and the treasury filled. His rule was the antidote to madness: practical, simple, even dull. But dullness was the medicine Rome needed. The curse, however, could not be broken. It could only be contained. Vespasian's greatest innovation was not architecture or taxation. It was succession. He saw what killed the emperors before him: uncertainty. Every death opened the gates to civil war, so he designed a lock made of blood. He made his son Titus commander of the Praetorian Guard. The logic was brutal and brilliant. If the emperor's heir commanded the men with swords, then rebellion became suicide. For a time, it worked. The Guard's loyalty fused with family. Vespasian's dynasty, the Flavians, brought a rare peace to Rome. Bread returned to tables, coins shone with honest silver, and the people began to believe in empire again. When Vespasian died in 79 CE, he left calmly, whispering, "I think I'm becoming a god." Rome laughed, and Titus ascended without bloodshed, the first peaceful succession in a generation. But peace has its own shadows. Titus, once a soldier, became a ruler haunted by disaster. In his brief reign, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii. A plague swept the empire, fires consumed the capital. Rome began to whisper that even the good were cursed. When Titus died suddenly, his brother Domitian took the throne. He was young, paranoid, and obsessed with control. If Vespasian had built locks of trust, Domitian replaced them with chains of fear. He filled the palace with mirrors, spies, and secret trials. He demanded worship, not respect. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors, became his enforcers. Senators died in silence, their names erased, their estates confiscated. Domitian's reign turned the empire inward. Walls thickened, doors multiplied, and whispers replaced debate. Rome had learned stability, but it had forgotten freedom. He ruled for 15 years, longer than most dared to hope, but no mirror reflects loyalty forever. In 96 CE, a conspiracy reached his chamber. A servant once trusted drew a dagger. Domitian fell to the floor, bleeding out beneath the very walls that had echoed his orders. The Praetorians arrived too late, or perhaps exactly on time. They did not weep, they did not avenge, they waited. And when the Senate met, the Guard quietly approved the next emperor. Nerva, an old senator with no heirs, no armies, and no illusions. Rome, for the first time, was tired of blood. It would try something new: merit. But the ghosts of Sejanus, Caligula, and the guards still lingered in every corridor. The curse had not ended, it had simply adapted. Rome had learned to manage fear, but not to escape it. When Domitian's body cooled on the marble floor, Rome exhaled for the first time in 15 years. The Senate, shaking, chose an emperor who seemed harmless. Nerva, 70 years old, polite, and scholarly. A man who preferred scrolls to swords. They thought he would be a bridge between terror and peace. But even bridges tremble. The Praetorian Guard, furious that Domitian's assassins had gone unpunished, broke into the palace. They seized Nerva, held a blade to his throat and demanded justice. The emperor who preached mercy watched his guards murder the men who had made his reign possible. Rome had traded one tyrant for a hostage. Nerva understood then what Augustus, Claudius and Vespasian had learned before him. An emperor without soldiers is not an emperor at all. But the old man had one final stroke of genius. He did not have a son, but he could choose one. He adopted Marcus Ulpius Traianus, a general commanding 10 legions along the Rhine. The message was clear. Loyalty would no longer come from fear, blood, or bribes, but from competence. When Trajan arrived in Rome in 98 CE, the city roared. The guards saluted. The experiment had worked. Trajan was a soldier first, emperor second. He led from the front, shared his men's food, and punished corruption with mathematical precision. For the first time in a century, the guard respected the emperor because he had earned it, not because he had bought it. Under his reign, the empire reached its greatest extent, from the sands of Arabia to the fog of Britain. Roads, aqueducts and markets bloomed like veins of marble across the world. Trajan was no longer merely princeps, he was Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. The curse seemed broken. When Trajan died, his chosen heir Hadrian continued the system of adoption. He abandoned conquest for consolidation, drawing borders with reason instead of blood. The empire turned inward again, this time in reflection rather than fear. He built the wall that still bears his name, and temples that whispered eternity. Then came Antoninus Pius, whose reign was so peaceful that Rome forgot what rebellion even sounded like. And after him, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who wrote of reason, duty, and mortality, while leading wars on the frozen Danube. It was as if the gods had relented. 4 emperors, 4 men chosen not by birth but by merit. The century historians would later call the age of the 5 good emperors. But perfection carries its own decay. Marcus Aurelius, the thinker who had ruled with reason, made one fatal decision. He broke the chain of adoption. He named his son Commodus as heir. A father's love became an empire's undoing. The soldiers adored Commodus at first. He was handsome, athletic, generous. But the Praetorian Guard had seen this story before. They smiled, saluted, and sharpened their knives. The curse of Augustus stirred again, stretching after a century of sleep. The age of merit had ended. The age of inheritance, madness, and murder was about to return. The walls of marble that Hadrian had built would soon echo with screams once more. The dream of stability was over. The empire was about to remember what it truly was, a golden cage lined with rusting blades. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, his son Commodus inherited more than an empire. He inherited the impossible expectations of peace. Rome, swollen with wealth and pride, had forgotten how to bleed. Commodus would remind it. At first, the people adored him. He was young, radiant, a son of the philosopher king. But the emperor who followed a sage was not a student of wisdom. He was a performer of vanity. Commodus traded scrolls for swords. He dressed as Hercules, carrying a club, wearing a lion's skin, declaring himself the living god of strength. Senators shivered as he demanded they address him not as princeps, but as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The arena became his throne. He entered the Colosseum not to preside but to fight. Day after day he slaughtered wild beasts with ritual grace, pretending each victory was divine proof. Rome, the city that had once feared its emperors, now laughed as its ruler played at gladiator. But laughter can turn to fear with a single rumour. Commodus's paranoia deepened. Anyone who looked too long, spoke too freely, or wore purple by accident could die. Senators disappeared. His sister Lucilla conspired against him and was executed. The Praetorian Guard, rich with bribes, stood by and watched the empire rot from the inside. The palace turned into a labyrinth of silk and blood. Poisoned wine flowed. Corpses vanished before dawn. The guard had become both assassin and undertaker, maintaining the illusion of control while quietly counting the gold. But corruption feeds on itself. In 192 CE, when Commodus threatened to rename Rome Colonia Commodiana and march into the Senate dressed as a gladiator, even his protectors began to flinch. The plot came from within. His concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus, men and women who knew his secrets, decided that the empire could no longer endure its god. They slipped poison into his wine. He vomited it out. Desperate, they called for a backup. A wrestler named Narcissus entered the emperor's chamber, wrapped a cord around his throat and pulled. The self-proclaimed god died gasping on his own marble floor, his eyes bulging, his club fallen beside him. The Praetorians found the body. They did not mourn, they saw opportunity. For the second time in history, they decided to sell the throne. They marched to the Senate, declared the position vacant, and auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, outbid his rivals, 25,000 sesterces per guard. The deal was sealed with cheers and clinking armour. The world's greatest empire had become an item on the market. But the sale did not last. Within weeks, Julianus was dragged out and executed by soldiers loyal to Septimius Severus, a general from the Danube. The curse had evolved. The Praetorians were no longer gatekeepers, they were parasites. The empire had entered a new era where power belonged not to emperors, but to armies. The lesson was clear. When loyalty has a price, rebellion is just a better offer away. Commodus's reign ended not just a dynasty, but an illusion. Rome could no longer pretend that emperors ruled from virtue. They ruled from debt. And when the debts came due, the empire paid, in emperors. The laurel, once a symbol of victory, was now a crown of thorns. The demon that Augustus had conjured in marble and law had returned, laughing, wearing the face of every emperor who dared to believe he was safe. When Septimius Severus rode into Rome in 193 CE, the city smelled of ash and betrayal. The Praetorian Guard, those who had once auctioned the empire, knelt before him in their polished armour, hoping for pardon. Severus smiled. Then he gave his first order: disband them. The men who had sold emperors were stripped of rank, their weapons seized, their titles erased. Some fled, some begged, some vanished. In their place, Severus brought his own legions, tough, scarred soldiers from the Danube frontier, men who owed him everything. It was the cleverest move since Augustus created the Principate, and the most dangerous. For Severus had replaced the city's guard with the empire's army, and the army was not loyal to Rome, it was loyal to whoever fed and enriched it. He told his sons, Caracalla and Geta, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others." That was his legacy. Not marble, not laws, not philosophy. Just the arithmetic of survival. Rome had begun as a republic of farmers, turned into an empire of laws, and had now become a company of mercenaries. Under Severus, the emperor was no longer a man of the Senate or the gods or the people. He was a general-in-chief of a private army that happened to own the world. The Praetorian curse had mutated. The knife that once hid in the city's corridors now slept in the tents of legions. Power no longer changed hands in the marble halls of the capital, but in the muddy fields of the frontier. When Severus died in 211 CE, his final words were bitterly prophetic: "I have been all things, and nothing is worth it." His sons took his throne and immediately turned on each other. Within a year, Geta was dead, murdered by Caracalla in their mother's arms. Bloodline had failed again. The army watched in silence. They cared not who ruled, only that their pay arrived on time. Caracalla doubled their wages, emptied the treasury, and marched endlessly to keep them fed. He called himself a new Alexander, but his empire was already rotting. He was murdered on the road by his own guards, stabbed while relieving himself in a ditch. The lesson was clear. Severus had not broken the curse. He had perfected it. Now every general with a legion had the power to become emperor. Every soldier who killed him could become kingmaker. Every province was a throne waiting for a claimant. By the 3rd century, Rome no longer had emperors. It had casualties. 50 rulers in 50 years. Each rose on the promises of gold and loyalty, and each fell when the next general offered more. The empire split, fractured, and bled from within. The Praetorian Guard had once been the face of corruption. Now corruption had gone viral. But in the midst of the storm, one man understood the pattern. Diocletian, a soldier who had risen from nothing, looked at the ruins and saw the truth. No human could rule such an empire alone. Power had to be divided, diluted, exiled from itself. He created the Tetrarchy. 4 emperors, 4 capitals, no single centre. He abandoned Rome entirely, turning it from heart to relic. The emperor's throne was now mobile, untouchable. He ruled not as a god, but as an administrator of survival, and when he finally retired, willingly to grow cabbages in Dalmatia, the world was stunned. For the first time in history, an emperor had walked away from power alive. The curse had not been destroyed, it had simply been understood. The golden cage of Augustus, the madness of Caligula, the auctions, the murders, the betrayals, all had led to one truth. To be emperor was to serve the empire's appetite until it devoured you. Rome's dream of eternal rule had always been a myth. Its emperors were not gods, they were offerings, fed to the machine they commanded. And somewhere, beneath the ruins of palaces and temples, one could almost hear the echo of a whisper carried through the centuries. The laurel is still a noose,